So I will warn you, I am not on a regular hard line of internet. And so it is possible that I could cut out here and there. And usually if it cuts out, it takes about 10, 15 seconds and then it comes back. So I'm just warning you. We are going to be in Genesis chapter 15 if you guys want to move over there. Good morning, Mark.
Morning.
A little warm down there for you, Mark?
Just a tad bit, 111 today.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, today for us, it's 97 and 72% humidity. So it's supposed to feel like 109. Anyways, we're in Genesis chapter 15. And so we've been going through the call of Abram, and we looked at Genesis 12, where God gave Abram a promise, and it was there was 7 lines to this promise because it was a full, complete promise, which was pretty cool. It was God's going to bless Abram. He's going to make Abram a great nation. He's going to make Abram have a great name. He's going to bless all of the world through Abram. He's going to bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse Abram. So we talked about a whole bunch of all of that stuff, how that's important because it actually impacts us today, because the blessing that God gave Abram, actually of blessing the world through him, we still get to experience that. And we talked a little bit about some of the fun statistics on how I don't remember exactly the population of Jews in the world. It's like 1/5 of 0.1% or something. It's some real small number. But on top of that, the 20% of the Nobel Prizes have been to Jews. So we've just looked at some of the fun stuff on how we have been impacted by that blessing. So now we're going to go to Genesis 15, and this is a 5 to 10 years later, and this is really interesting. Some of the things that happen here, we don't have a lot of information on why, but we can make some speculations. But it's just really interesting, and this is where God really shows Adam and seals this deal on this promise for Abram. So let's see. We'll just start with verse 1. We'll start with Tim. Tim, can you read verse 1 of Genesis 15?
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield and the one who will reward you in great abundance.
Ooh, I like that. What version do you have, Tim?
Net. I just went to the Net Bible.
Nice. Okay, so we'll start off here in verse 1. This is interesting. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And so what I want to point out here is something that Jody mentioned last time we were in Genesis 12, is all these different ways that God has been revealing himself to Abram. And in chapter 12, it said that God said to Abram, and then it said that, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was the word of the Lord came to Abram, and there was these different ways that he was coming. And then here we have the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying. And I want to point out, I think this shows that God has a sense of humor. Because if you want to look at this verse and try to figure out how did God speak to Abram right here, good luck, because it's really funny that he says the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying. So we've got this, the word came in a vision, which doesn't sound right, and then the vision, and he was saying. So it's all these senses that he's coming to Abram in. And so it's pretty cool. But the big point that we want to get from this is God speaks to us in all sorts of different ways, and you don't want to limit it. You don't want to say, well, God only speaks this particular way, because what we've been seeing with Abram is God speaks to him in a whole bunch of different ways. Later on, in a couple more chapters, he comes and he visits Abram and they have food together. So it's, if God happens to call you on the telephone, he's allowed to do that. He can use any method of communication that he wants. Now, I've never heard of him doing that, but hey, you don't want to say that can't be God because it came from the telephone. You got to be open to see how he wants to come and speak to you. Mark, you were going to say something.
No, I thought you were going to take it old school and say pager.
That's right. That's right. He could page you. I don't know if anybody has any pagers anymore, so I don't know that that'll work. But he speaks in all sorts of different ways, right? Sometimes people hear him audibly. Sometimes you can sense what he's saying. Sometimes he speaks through your words. Sometimes he speaks to you through another person. There's just all these different ways that the Lord will speak to us, and we don't want to just ignore things because he comes and reveals himself in a manner we're not expecting or we're not used to. It also means you should expect him to come reveal himself to you in all sorts of different ways, and that's pretty cool. There is one thing that does seem to be consistent, though, that is really interesting, is notice that it says, and after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram. And so it's really interesting. It is the word of the Lord that God is using to speak to Abram, although he does it in a vision. So it's weird because it's the word, which we usually think of that as a written way or maybe audible, but it comes in a vision, so he's actually seeing it. So it's just interesting the way God does that, but he does seem to consistently speak to us through his word.
He also asked him, "Do not be afraid."
That's right. That's right.
It seems to come up a lot when there's a vision of an angel. They always say, "Do not be afraid." I guess it must be a pretty frightening experience.
But God's speaking to him.
Right.
Which one do you think it is?
Frightening, I think. Don't be afraid. You probably want to duck for cover when you see that.
Yeah. I like that when God comes to people, he often says, right? That's one of the first things. When you see angels coming to speak to people, that's almost always the first thing the angel says is, "Don't be afraid," because they're kind of scary, right? They're very, very powerful. You're now in the presence of some being that could easily just wipe you out and you have no power over. And so there's this tendency to be, oh man, because you need to have some fear, you need to have some respect. I like one of my favorite passages is in Daniel, where an angel comes to Daniel while he's asleep and he falls on the floor while he's asleep because he's in so much fear of this angel just coming into his presence. And so we have the same type of thing. God saying, "Do not be afraid." But I like what he says to Abram. He says, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield." And so that's a very comforting thing, is God's coming to Abram and he's saying, I'm not coming I'm not coming as the sword. I'm coming as a shield, right? I'm coming to protect you, Abram. And so there's a lot of comfort in that. When someone so powerful as the Lord comes into your presence and says, I'm here as your shield, then he's saying he's coming to protect you. And then, what do you have to be afraid of, right? Because you recognize how powerful he is. And so I like that. The thing is, we can get into this idea that when God comes, he's always coming as a shield. But that's not actually true, right? When we look at some of the prophecy of when he comes in the future, he doesn't come as a shield. He doesn't come to protect man. He comes to judge, and he comes with a sword. And that's going to be a terrible, frightening time for people when God isn't your shield. So it's a cool thing when God says he's your shield. It also reminds us that, there's two ways that you can approach God, or that you can be approached by God. You can come to him in submission and recognizing that he's your Lord and following him, or you can come to him in rebellion as an enemy, and then he has to treat you in a different way, and he doesn't come as a shield at that time.
It's all good morning, you guys. It's also comforting just the fact that he does shield us from so much that we'll never realize until we get to heaven. When things hit us, So fiery darts of the evil one, they actually get through whatever his shielding is of us. We're like, where were you on that one? But we have no idea what he's actually deflecting from us, that we're getting such a small percentage that he allows into our lives to grow us and to better us. And I recently learned, this is probably old news to you because you're Mr. Science, John, but the gravitational pull of Saturn is so big that it sucks so many meteors and comets that would hit the Earth, and it sucks them to hit the planet. So it's basically a linebacker or a lineman, if you look at a football analogy, protecting the Earth from being destroyed. So it is our shield, and that analogy kind of reminds me of God. He's our Saturn protecting us, so we get maybe a tiny smidgen of this stuff that Satan's thrown at us, or if in the case of Saturn itself, what space is throwing at it. So being a shield, the shield of faith, that's very comforting.
Amen.
Yeah, that's great, right? He is our shield. We don't see all the things that he's protecting us, but we can put our trust that he sees everything. So it's pretty cool. I was going to read what Pastor Brian said. Our king wears a crown. That's right. And Saturn has its rings like a crown. It's all a pretty cool, amazing thing. And I don't want to miss that last part. In my version, it says, he says, I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward. And the way Tim's Bible phrased that was interesting. He says he's the giver of rewards. I can't remember. Can you read that again, Tim?
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield and the one who will reward you in great abundance.
Interesting. I like that. So this is this continuation of this promise that God keeps giving to Abram, where he is going to bless him and he's giving him the rewards and all of these things. But we don't want to miss one of the other aspects of this is that God is the one who's doing all of this, right? He's the one who's protecting Abram. He's the one who's rewarding Abram and blessing Abram. And this is all on God. This is all his responsibility. It's not on Abram. Abram isn't supposed to have to do something here or there to get blessings. It's not a transactional thing. It's a relational thing where God's like, I'm here and I'm going to shield you and protect you and bless you and reward you. And so this is all on God. And I like that. It's his responsibility. All right. Let's next couple verses, which are interesting. Dad, can you read 3?
2 and 3.
Yes, please.
But Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir.
All right. So this is one of the things that Abram struggles with. Even so, he struggled with this before. He's going to struggle with it later. But we have to remember that Abram has no kids, right? Sarai is barren. They can't have kids. They can't physically have kids. And so he has none. And so when God gave him this promise, and remember, this was 5 to 10 years ago when God gave him this promise that, hey, he's going to make a great nation out of Abram. Abram's at this place where you made this promise, God, that that you're going to make a great nation out of me. And I believe the promise, but I don't understand because I can't have kids and I still don't have kids. And after all this time to Abram, it looks like God hasn't really been making any progress on this particular promise. And so I want to point this out. We might look at this and think, oh man, Abram is just doubting God here with this particular issue. And I don't think that this is necessarily the case. And we'll actually get a little bit further where we understand that he does totally trust in God for this promise. But this can be one of those things where you hear from God, and after some time passes, you start to kind of doubt what you heard and kind of go, okay, maybe he meant something else. I think maybe Abram's in this place of maybe God is going to keep this promise, but he's going to do it in some way that I don't understand, and I'm not going to actually have kids. Maybe Eleazar is going to be the one to bring this great nation, and somehow it'll get attributed to Abram. So he's kind of in this place. He's like, I don't understand, God, because you haven't been progressing on this promise, and yet this is, it's been a lot of time, and so what's going to happen here? And so this is really interesting. Let's see. I want to point out one other thing here, which in Abram's mind, it probably seems like this might not be a high priority to God, right? It's been some years and nothing's going on. And this is one of those things where that happens with us and God, where he can give us a promise and we're thinking, okay, this God's working on it. He's working on it right now, but we don't see anything. And so we think, well, God's not really working on it. Maybe he didn't forget, but it's just not a high priority. And so I think there's a lot of these different thoughts going through Abram right now, and he's trying to figure out, maybe he misunderstood, maybe he's just not understanding what's going to happen here. It doesn't seem like it's even possible. And as time progresses, right, he's getting older and it's even less possible for him to have children. So instead of getting closer to this promise, it feels to Abram like he's getting further away. So I like that God is going to respond here, and he doesn't get upset with Abram and any of this. So this isn't a doubt where he's like doubting God and saying, hey, God, you got to do something because you're not keeping up on your promise. He's asking for clarification here. And so I like that because God doesn't get upset here. All right, verse 4-6. Let's see. Who can we have read? Elijah, can you read verse 4-6?
Of course. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Then he brought him outside and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness.
Right. So so first we have this, again, there's a whole conversation going on Abram and God, and that's pretty cool. God comes to Abram in a vision and starts speaking to him, and Abram is able to speak back to God and ask him questions, ask for clarification, and God responds. So they're having an actual full-on regular conversation like you and I might have a conversation. And that's pretty cool. I just want to point that out. And we've seen that already, but we want to keep pointing it out that God is having a conversation with Abram because that's his desire, even with us, is to have a conversation where it's a two-sided communication, right? We are speaking to him and listening, and he's speaking to us and he's listening. So it's going back and forth. And so God doesn't get angry, but he just reassures Abram of this promise. He takes him outside, points to the star, and says, that's how many descendants you're going to have. So again, this is God reaffirming this promise, letting Abram know that he wasn't mistaken, that Eleazar is not going to be his heir. This promise of a great nation isn't going to come through Eleazar, but he himself is going to have a child, at least one, and they're going to and that's going to all happen. And so this is a cool thing. I just want to point this out. This is a cool thing. God and Abram are talking, and he has this promise, and he's asking about it because he wants clarification. And not only does God not get upset, but he also clarifies that this is all happening, and that Abram is going to have his own child, his own descendant. So we see that he says, look to the stars, and the number of your descendants shall be. And then he said in verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. So this verse 6 here is amazing, right? God is saying he accounted it as righteousness to Abram because Abram believed in the Lord. I just want to point out here, we have the same type of thing going on right now. This is one of those cool things where you can look at and people will say, you know, how were people saved before Jesus was born? How could you have salvation before the Messiah was born? And so we have this whole picture right here, and it turns out it's the same way that we're saved. It's all through faith and trust in him. Now it says he believed in the Lord, and that doesn't mean he believed that the Lord existed, right? It doesn't mean that he believed that the Lord was the all-powerful God. What it means here is he put his trust in God. He believed that what God said was true, and he was going to trust that what God said was true. And he's going to follow God because he believes and trusts in him. And I'm pointing that out because even in our time, people can get confused and think, well, I believe that God is real, and they think that that saves them. But that's not what saves you. It doesn't mean that you believe he's real. What saves you is putting your trust in Jesus. And so we see that same type of thing in the Old Testament. They have to put their trust in God, that God is going to save them, and that's how they are saved. Same thing for us. Now they had promises of someone who was going to come and save them, but that was all going in the future. For us, we have already seen that, right? Jesus has already come onto the scene. He has already been born. So it's not a future promise of a Messiah coming, although we still have a future promise of a Messiah coming again. But we're saved because, and let me back up. We are saved, but we're ahead in time. We are past the time when Jesus was born. They are saved, but they're saved through trusting in the promise of that Savior coming. It's pretty cool.
That one little sentence is pretty amazing. You're exactly right. I mean, that's a foundation for doctrinal belief, justified by grace through faith. It's amazing what's packed into that, just a few little words.
And he's not saved because of anything he does, right? It's just that he puts his trust in God. He puts his trust in God, and God says, Abram's righteous because of that. It's pretty cool. And the thing that's amazing about this is that means the barrier for salvation is low. That's all it takes, right?
Thank
You just have
God.
to put your trust in God. That's right. Thank God it is. That means anybody can be saved.
And Abram's testimony during those days was pretty simple. That, hey, Abram, why are you so blessed? Hey, I believe, and he keeps walking. And that's all. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah. It's like I'm following God. He's telling me
Right.
what to do. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm following him. Yeah. It's amazing. Do you think that Abram has an advantage to knowing God, or do you think we have an advantage? I mean, Abram lives in a time before the Bible's written, before a lot of this revelation is, but he also gets to experience a special type of revelation of God, whereas we have a lot of other, God reveals himself to us in some different ways, some of the same. What do you guys think? Do you think it'd be easier to follow God back in Abram's time or in our time?
Our time's a lot less messy. I mean, we're not going around slaughtering animals every day. We don't have blood on the floor.
Yeah. Dad, I think you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
There you go. Cindy's playing music, and so if you hear music in the background, I am not going to stop that. Anyway, I think that it's easier in our times because we can look to the cross. We can see the cross. We see the resurrection. We have that. We know that the babe came, it was born of a virgin. They didn't know how it was going to happen, but we do. And so I think that they would have more of what you call blind faith, and we would have more of what you call knowledge faith. but that's just my opinion.
That's
I think he died.
Turned into a dog.
wow. I got kicked all the
There
way
he
out.
goes.
Sorry about that.
Apparently, we weren't following the guidelines, John.
I guess not. Um, that anyways, what you were saying, Dad, is a good segue. let's move into the next session. But I agree. I mean, it's interesting. I think a lot of what stops us from following and trusting in God is our own selves. I think we get in our own ways, and so we have some advantages into His revelation of who He is. But there's a lot of other things that'll distract you if you really want to be distracted. Let's get into verse 7 through 8. Let's see. Michael, are you up for reading verse 7 and 8?
Yeah, sure. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it?
So I love God's response back to Abram, which is, I am the Lord. And so we've got that phrase there, I am, which I'm sure that Abram doesn't know the significance of this phrase yet, but later on we'll find out that this is one of those things that God likes to say, I am. And he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans. So here's one of those things that God is saying to Abram is he's reminding Abram of who he is. And he's saying, I am the Lord, right? I am God. I am the one who's in charge of everything. And then he reminds Abram, I'm the one who brought you out of the place that you were in. So there's this cool aspect where although he's asking Abram to trust him, he isn't asking Abram to trust him without evidence. He is saying, hey, I am God, and you know that I'm God because I've been leading you this time to this place that you're at. And so there's this past history that Abram has. Now, maybe it's not very much history. Maybe there's not a lot going on yet, but there is some things that Abram can look back to in his past and see that God was involved in his life, and he was involved by pulling him out of Ur from his father's land in his area. And so he knows that he's been following this God. He's been following God for a while. And so I just want to point that out. I like that God doesn't say, hey, follow me because I said so. He's saying, follow me because look at the past and where you followed me in the past and how that has worked out. He says, follow me because if you look, you can see how God has been trustworthy throughout your life. If you look in your past and you look at where you have trusted him. And so I like that that's what's going on right here is God is saying, hey, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans. And so I like that. And then Abram's response is really interesting. He says, and he said to the Lord, how shall I know that I will inherit it? And so we just want to be a little careful when we read this because it looks like Abram is doubting God. But I want to point out that Abram's not doubting God because just in verse 6, it says, he believed in the Lord and it was accounted as righteousness. So this isn't a question of Abram doubting that God is going to keep his promise. What he's asking for, and I also want to point out, this is not Abram saying, hey, show me a sign and then I'll follow you. This is, I'm already following you, Lord. And so I want to point that out too. This isn't a time where he's saying, and this is one of those dangerous places people can get in, right? They're going to say, God, you show me a sign and then I'll follow you. And God's saying, hey, I already showed you a sign. I already sent Jesus. I already gave you all of this information and you're still not following me. This isn't one of those circumstances. This is Abram is following the Lord. It already said in verse 6 that he puts his full trust in the Lord. And he's saying here in verse 8, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? And so what he's asking for here is he's asking for a memorial. He's asking for a way for him to, when he looks back, he can be sure, he can be reminded of this. And so again, this is a question of both clarity and also a question of remembrance, so that, remember, he struggles with this and he'll struggle with this even more, but he wants to be able to look back on this time and say, okay, I know I heard God clearly. I know he said this. God, how can we do this so this is really clear? And again, God doesn't get upset with Abram here. And I just find that fascinating that God doesn't seem to get upset when we bring our issues to him, when we bring our problems to him, when we're having a conversation with him. He doesn't seem to get upset with that. He does get upset when we're disobedient. He says, I want you to do this. And you're like, are you sure? I don't want to do that. Right? But he's not getting upset at Abram. There's none of this disobedience. There's none of this doubting. There is just, hey, God, I want to make sure I know what's going on here. And I want to be able to look back and look at this time and know for sure that you said what you've promised, that you're gonna do what you've promised. So let's
Didn't you say that it was about 10 to 15 years he's been waiting for something?
that's right.
I mean, that's why he asked that question.
That's right. There's and we even saw back in chapter 12 when he heard from the Lord in Bethel. If you recall, he heard from the Lord. He built an altar, and it was a memorial. It was a memorial so that he can remember this place where he talked with the Lord. The Lord talked back to him. He had this conversation. So this is the same type of thing where he's like, God, I want to be able to remember this. I want to make sure that we're on the same page here. And so this is one of those cool events. Before we get on to the next passage, what do you think about memorials? We don't really do memorial type of things anymore, right? We don't really ever, and as the Israelites were traveling along in the desert, they would often, when something happened, they would pile up 12 stones on top of each other so that when their kids asked, they would say, well, this is what happened right here. And so Abram's kind of asking for something like that. We don't do that too often. What do you think? Do you think that we should? What do you think about a memorial? Is a memorial a good thing? Dad, you're muted again.
Here we go. I think we do memorials all the time. We call them pictures. We put pictures all over our walls. This is our kids. This is when we did this. This is when we did that.
Okay.
You know, they didn't have pictures in those days, so they piled up rocks and they'd say, what are those rocks? And they'd say, well, those rocks are a reminder of when this happened. But we do pictures, and those pictures are our memorials.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's a fair point. I remember reading something where this author was saying that when there's certain events that happen in your life that are very big and important, you need to have some type of ceremony for it as a memorial, just so that time is burned into your brain so that you remember it, and your kids and your family and whoever else is there will remember it. And so we do have some of those. Like if you graduate from college, right, they have a graduation ceremony. If you graduate from high school, they have a graduation ceremony. And these are these types of memorials. These are these events, these ceremonies that happen, so you don't forget what happened, and other people around you can see what happened, and they know this is what happened as well.
They also must be important because we see Satan trying to tear down memorials. There, of our founders, say there's memorials to George Washington, and when we look at it, it reminds us of a time, and that we are blessed even when times are tough. If you look at our present day, so those are good, and you take them to the sites. You take them to Boston where the Revolutionary War took place, and okay, Jimmy, your son, here's where this happened, and there's George Washington, and it's a great segue and lead into that. And if you tear that down, you can rewrite history, and we've seen what communism does with that. So.
And all of this is good for us to know that our memories fade and our memories dull. And after time, we not only forget things, but we forget important things, right? And so this is one of those things that God is not upset if we ever look back in our past and look at those important things and remember how he's saved us, how he's been faithful. He wants us to have those times. For the Jews, he set up a whole bunch of festivals and feasts for them, so that they would remember events like Passover and when they left Egypt and all of those things. He didn't want them to forget that those things happened, because he knew that after a long period of time, we have a history of forgetting those things. And so here we have this, and Abram is asking for something, and now we're going to look at what happens here. And so I'll read verse 9 and 10. So this is God responding, and he says in verse 9, so he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these things to him and cut them in two down the middle and placed each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. So here we have God making a covenant with Abram, and that's what he's telling Abram to do. He's telling him to get this ready, and they're basically, this is how you do a contract in those times. Now, I will point out that this is really, really long time ago in history. This is pretty ancient, and so we don't have all the details on how all of these this type of covenant would work. So, but what we do know is that Abram's in this time, and he understands exactly what God's asking him to do. They're going to make a covenant. And I will point out another thing, which is when it says when we call it making a covenant, and when your Bible says making a covenant, that word making literally means cut. So they're cutting a covenant. Oh, just a second. Something happened here. All right, so you're cutting a covenant, which means you're taking all these animals and you're cutting them in pieces. And then the idea of this cutting a covenant is you cut all these animals up, and the two parties would walk between the animals. And as they're walking between the animals, each party would say what their part of the deal is, right? So if they're making a promise to do something, as they're walking through, they'll give their promise. The two parties walk through. And the idea of this cutting a covenant is if either party breaks their side of the covenant, then you're allowed to kill them. You're allowed to do what you've just done to these animals, some type of ritualistic killing or just a killing. But the idea is very clear. You're promising to do something, and at the expense of doing that, the expense of breaking your promise would be that you are killed. So I'm just bringing this up. So some of the things that's really interesting here is he tells him to bring a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram. And so there's 3 of these animals that are supposed to be 3 years old. We don't know the significance of this exactly. I'm sure Abram probably had a good idea what it was. We're not even 100% sure that he's saying a 3-year-old heifer or a 3-year-old goat. It could be the third heifer, like the third child, or the third goat, or it could be a heifer that's been working for 3 years, or a goat that's been working for 3 years. So it's somewhere around there. I think I have a theory about what this means, but we'll talk about that in a little bit later. So, but I just want to point out there's this tradition that they have where they're going to make a contract, And Abram understands that that's what's happening right now, and that God is going to make a contract with him. And what he's saying is, God is saying is, if he doesn't fulfill his promise, he will pay with his life. And on the other side, if Abram doesn't fulfill his promise, he will pay with his life. So that's what's happening. That's what's going on right here. Now, if you recall back in the promise, back in chapter 12, that was when God gave this promise to Abram. There was two parts. Abram had to follow God, and then if Abram followed God, remember, God said, Abram, go out of your town, go away from your parents, your family. And then if he does that, God said, and I will bless you. He gave him that 7-part promise. So there are two aspects of this. There's the aspect of God, of Abram following God, and then God giving this promise of blessing, of having children and descendants and a great nation. Now, there's something really cool that happens here in this whole covenant, and we'll try to get to that. Let's see. Look at time. Oh, we only got 10 minutes. I don't know if we're going to get there. We're going to try. Verse 11, it says, let's see. Verse 11 says, and when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So here's this cool thing that God's showing to Abram. I don't know if Abram catches this or not, but God says, go get these animals, get them ready for a covenant. So Abram does that. He goes, he gets the animals, he cuts them, and guess what? God doesn't show up. He's sitting there with all these dead animals around him, and then vultures start coming. And so these vultures are coming, and Abram has to get up and he has to shoo all the vultures away. And I like this because what happens is God is showing Abram that just because he makes a promise, just because God says he's going to do something, doesn't mean it's going to happen immediately right when he said it. He's going to do it in a perfect time. And so Abram's here where he's got to wait on the Lord. He's got to wait for God to come and do this covenant with him. And while he's doing it, these vultures come and they try to steal the animals. And I also find that interesting. Have you guys ever come across a vulture before? I have a couple times, and what's happened is when you get close, vultures get up and they leave. But apparently these vultures are fairly aggressive because they actually are trying to steal the animal pieces of this covenant. They're trying to steal and prevent Abram from having this covenant with God. And so Abram has to actually drive them away. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think these are aggressive vultures, or maybe there's a spiritual aspect going on here? What do you think?
My vote's aggressive.
Maybe Satan's like, oh man, God's gonna make a covenant with Abram. I don't want that to happen, and he's getting involved. I don't know the answer to that. It's just really interesting. I find it interesting that Abram's with these pieces of animals, and vultures are coming. And usually they wait until everything's dead, but apparently these ones aren't going to do that. All right. Verse 12 through 16. 12 says, now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age, but in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So he shooed these birds away, and then God makes him, he has this great sleep fall upon him. And this is while the sun's going down. So we don't know how long Abram has to wait, but he cuts all these animals up. He's got to shoo away the vultures. And then the sun's coming down. And then he goes into this deep sleep. And one of the things that's interesting here is we see that horror and great darkness fell upon him. And this is kind of unexpected, right? If you are waiting on a contract, say, okay, these are some promises that I'm obligated to give you because it's a contractual agreement. You would think this is this great time of joy and happiness and peace, but what we see here from Abram is he goes into the sleep and he experiences horror and darkness. And what's happening here is God is showing him, he's revealing to him some more of what's going to happen in the future. God doesn't have to do this, but he does this. And he shows to Abram that he is going to keep his promise, but it's going to take hundreds of years. We even see here, God says 400 years, right? So that's quite a long time. And he's telling Abram that it's going to be a dark period of time because they're going to be servants to these people who are going to treat them not well. But at the end of this 400-year period, they're going to come out and they're going to have a lot of possessions, and then they're going to come into this land. And so this is one of those things that we see. It's a good news, bad news type of deal where God is saying, the good news is I'm making a great nation out of you. The bad news is they're going to be slaves for 400 years in a land that's not theirs. And so this is this interesting way that God does it. Why do you think God reveals this to Abram?
I think, he's not just revealing it to Abraham. I think he's revealing it to the Jewish nation, because they're going to keep records of this and they're going to go back and read this. And nothing, is more encouraging than reading about prophecy that's fulfilled.
And also, right, and we've been talking, we forget some of those promises as time goes by. And he doesn't want Abram and his descendants to feel like, hey, God's abandoning us because we are in this foreign land and we are servants. Because God is saying, no, that's what's going to happen. That's all part of the plan. And so when they get in that position, there's this idea that God, and this was all part of the plan. What's also interesting is at that last verse, in verse 16, he says, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So he's not going to dispossess the people of Canaan just because. He's not going to dispossess them and say, okay, I'm taking the land out, I'm ripping the land out of your hands, and I'm putting the Jews in here, and there we go. He's saying, no, they're losing the land because of judgment of sin, because what they've done, they're going to be judged for it. But it hasn't happened yet. It's not full. It's not complete. So he's waiting until that's complete, and then they'll be dispossessed. So they will be and removed from the land because they're judged. But God's plan is also to swoop the Jews in there and stick them in the land at that same time. So it's
That
kind of
also
cool. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that last sentence also shows the grace and the patience of the Lord, because he gave the Amorites 400 years to repent. And of course they didn't, but that's another strong point to show his patience.
Yeah, 400 years, that is a long time. That's not just one generation, right? That's
Right.
multiple generations. He's allowing somebody to break away from the pattern of their history, of their family, and follow God. And I'm not surprised to find out that there are some who do that, right? That they do get to survive because they did break away from that pattern. We all have the ability to break away from our personal history, from our how do you say that? From our family history, and turn and repent and follow God, because he shows that much grace. We're not trapped into it just because our parents were trapped into it. Now, unfortunately, like you said, Tim, they don't. But They have that option. They have that ability. It's a pretty amazing thing. I'm looking at the time. It's not going to be able to get through this part right here. So I guess not next Friday, but the following Friday, we'll finish this off and look at some pretty amazing aspects of this covenant that God is cutting with Abram, and we'll go over this next part, which is also very interesting. If you want to read it and look at it, there's a smoldering pot and a fiery torch, and some interesting pictures that happen there. But I just want to remind you, this is all an amazing event that happens where God is having this conversation with Abram, and now he's setting a memorial, something that will be etched in the mind of Abram forever, so he can be confident that God's plan is that he's going to have his own children and that they're going to make a nation. Now, unfortunately, in the next chapter, we'll see that still Abram struggles with this, and he's like, okay, well, God's not making any progress on this, so maybe I need to go be with my concubine and have a child through that way, because we can't have a child through Sarah. And so he still struggles with this, but God still loves him too. And still, just because Abram struggles with this does not mean that God's not going to keep his promise. God's still going to keep his promise. He's still going to make Abram a great nation, make his name great, bless all of mankind through Abram's family. That's all still going to happen, even when Abram struggles. So it's pretty cool. All right. Let's see. Elijah, would you pray for us? And then we'll close it out.